Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to AI for Good. We hope that you, your family, your friends, and your colleagues are all keeping healthy and safe. My name is Fred Werner from the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, and it's a privilege to introduce today's webinar. Now, the ITU is the United Nations Specialized Agency for Information and Communication Technologies, and we're also the organizers of the AI for Good Global Summit alongside X Prize Foundation in partnership with 38 UN sister agencies, ACM, and co-convened with Switzerland. Now, the goal of the summit is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. And one of our claims to fame is that we're action-oriented and we're more than just a talk shop. And I believe that today's webinar is a perfect example of that, as we look at how X Prize launched and completed the Pandemic Response Challenge in record time and discuss how crowdsourcing AI might help to build a more resilient future. Now, before I introduce today's moderator, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping issues. First of all, the chat and Q&A function should be used if you wish to communicate, and it's the role of the moderator to identify questions and ask them to the panelists, and we're counting on your active participation to create a very interactive session. And speaking of being interactive, I have a first challenge for you. Can you please let us know where you're connecting from? Simply use the chat function and make sure it's marked chat to everyone, and just type in what city, what country, what region, what company you're joining from. Here, I'll go first. Geneva, Switzerland. Australia, Dallas. Costa Rica, Brussels, London. Wow, that's all Singapore, Norway, Oslo. Oh, that's really great. Detroit, Michigan. Okay, welcome everyone. And there's more coming in as we go. You'll see it in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's moderator. Her name is Susan Emer, and she's VP of Strategic Alliances for X Prize Foundation. Susan, welcome, and the show is all yours.
Thank you so much, Fred, and welcome everyone to part 3 of the AI for Good in Action webinar series. Next slide, please. So this webinar series highlighted how the world came together in an unprecedented way to fight COVID-19 and showcased the recently awarded Pandemic Response Challenge launched by X Prize and sponsored by Cognizant. But for the agenda today, we're first going to have welcome and introductions. We're going to talk a little bit about the Pandemic Response Challenge. We're going to go into a really exciting panel. We'll have time for Q&A, and then we'll talk about next steps and opportunities. And I encourage you to stay to the very end because we'll have an important announcement. So a little tease there. Next slide. Great. So the Pandemic Response Challenge was just awarded 2 months ago. As I said, it was sponsored by Cognizant. And basically, the challenge required teams to build effective data-driven AI systems capable of accurately predicting COVID-19 transmission rates and prescribing intervention and mitigation measures that, with testing with what-if scenarios, were shown to minimize infection rates as well as negative impacts. The goal of the competition was to build a collaborative AI for Good ecosystem to assist in developing regional plans, not only for COVID-19, but for future pandemics as well. Next slide. So it really does take a village. As we said, this was a collaborative effort. It was sponsored by Cognizant, but we had amazing partners all along the way, and was the reason that it was such a success. Next slide. So really, as Fred alluded to, the Pandemic Response Challenge was X Prize's fastest competition yet. In just under 4 months, we had team recruitment, solution development from the teams, judging and awarding the prize. We also had, it was a truly global effort. We had 366 teams pre-register from 52 countries. Then it went down to 48 finalists from 15 countries. And then we had our 2 winners, which we'll showcase next slide, please. In first place was Team Valencia from Valencia, Spain. They were in first place. And then second place, next slide, was Team JSI versus COVID. Both teams, these 2 winning teams, split the $500,000 prize purse, so $250,000 each. Next slide. Now, for those who may have missed the first two webinars, or maybe you weren't just paying attention, the first episode was all about crowdsourcing AI for future resilience. It featured Brett Greenstein from Cognizant and Chae-Sub Lee from ITU. And they had a very stimulating conversation about the importance of crowdsourcing and collaborative data sharing as a model for innovation and success. Then episode 2 were the two teams that you just saw, and they talked about their winning solutions. But we're not done. Even though the prize was awarded, think of it as, you just binge watched season 1 of The Crown, or maybe in this case, because it's an international audience, Money Heist. And you're thinking, wait, is this the end? Well, it's not the end. So today we're going to hear from key partners, Cognizant, Oxford University, and Burst IQ. And they were very much a part of the success of the competition, but also they've committed to continuing the work. So think of it as season 2. So now let me pass the remote control over to Andrew Tauhert, XPRIZE's Chief Advancement Officer, to introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for that overview and for that introduction. And thank you all for joining here and listening to us today. As Susan said, we have the honor of being joined by several influential fellow folks from Cognizant, Burst IQ, and Oxford. I'm going to start off by letting them each say a word or two about what they do and what their organization is about, and then we'll jump into the panel. So first, I'll start with Babak Hojat, CTO of AI at Cognizant. Babak, you want to share us a word or two about yourself?
Sure. I run R&D for AI for Cognizant and have a team that does research as well as development. And we were behind much of the technology and that went into the pandemic response challenge last year, and very, very excited that it's becoming the inspiration for this AI for Good operation.
Thank you, and thanks for being here. Next up is Risto Mikalainen, the Associate VP of Evolutionary AI at Cognizant. Risto? I think you're muted, Risto.
Right, of course. Yes, so yes, this is Risto Mikalainen, and I'm a research lead in Cognizant AI Labs. I'm also a professor at the University of Texas at Austin in computer science, and have been there for quite a few decades, taking the technology to the world. And one of the most interesting and fun projects in the last few decades has been the XPRIZE competition, taking cutting edge machine learning and changing the world with it, doing something good with it.
Thank you. Next up is Amber Hartley, the Chief Strategy Officer at Burst IQ.
Thank you. Yeah, so Burst IQ operates the LifeGraph network, which is a global data exchange that's person-centric, allows for governance and consent of data and data across many different sources. We focus on healthcare and identity data. We've been working with XPRIZE for a while to support both challenges and more broadly initiatives at XPRIZE around data exchange and collaboration for research and AI. So we're thrilled to be here and really happy to support this initiative.
Thank you. And last but not least is Toby Phillips, the Executive Director of Oxford COVID-19 Government Response Tracker at Oxford University.
Hi, yeah. So the Oxford Government Response Tracker, we record daily government policies all around the world in almost 200 countries and many subnational states and territories, reporting how governments are responding to COVID and putting these policies into kind of a systematic, comparable data set. We've got almost 4 million data points that we've been collecting, and a tool like or a competition like the XPRIZE is really exciting for us because we produce this relatively inert data set that is basically a big CSV. It's a big data set. The XPRIZE brought all the capability, capacity, and enthusiasm to turn it into something that generated live insights and new information for decision makers.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you all for joining. Thank you all for helping us get to this point. Excited about this panel discussion where I think we've got great representation looking at both the kind of the data elements as well as the AI elements of this. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing myself and ask our panelists to come on video so we can start an exchange here. I'll ask a set of questions, but a reminder to everybody who's out there joining us today, feel free to put questions in the chat or use the chat, the Q&A function. Assuming there's time at the end, we'll be happy to go through those as well. But without further ado, I'll get started. Babak, I think I'll address the first question to you, especially since as it relates to this journey to develop this challenge, you were probably one of the earliest ones to start it. So, why do you believe, in essence, this pandemic response challenge itself was necessary, and why do you think this challenge is important to all of us?
Yes, I mean, this whole thing started because we were all stuck in the pandemic working from home, and it impacted all of us personally in one way or other, at different levels, of course. And we wanted to do something about it. And when we originally at Cognizant around March of last year set out to build a system that demonstrated the efficacy of AI, not just in predicting what's going to happen, but also in prescribing policies, we were overwhelmed by the response we got from Cognizant. Cognizant is a global company, and we have many, many associates around the world. And just the fact that we saw people coming in from Belgium, from India, from around the world, around the US, everywhere, volunteering their time, working extra hours on this, was an inspiration that later on, when we actually stood up the system in May, and I had a chat with my good friend Amir at XPRIZE, when he suggested that we actually build an XPRIZE challenge out of this, it made a lot of sense. The pandemic hits everyone, but there is a diversity of impact depending on where you are. And then there's a diversity of regional responses from people. And there are differences in, and commonalities. I mean, it's the same virus. And so we stand to learn from that. And that inspired us to bring forth a means by which we can pool our intellectual resources into tackling the problem. And it was very, very important for us, to make sure that this comes together as the pandemic is still unfolding, as we are dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. So of course that was difficult, but at the same time, it inspired us all to work much harder and to show that we can impact this problem as it's unfolding.
I think difficult for those that competed on it. Difficult is probably an understatement. I mean, we certainly, as Susan said, we ran this all in 4 months, which gave those that were competitors joining the prize precious little time to develop their submissions for 2 phases of a project as well. So, when you think about what we got out of it and what the submissions look like and what came of it, I'm sure it's surprising that so much happened in such a short period of time. Maybe Risto, can you share us, your views of what came out of it? Maybe even, what surprised you coming out of it as well?
Yeah, so the first, I think, main result is that this kind of an approach of using AI, of building predictors and also building prescriptors of not just what will happen, but what should we do about it. And we can use AI for problems like that. That was a verification that this is possible. And that was, of course, something we were shooting for and hoping it would happen. And it did. And that was really great. And it was also shown that the variety of approaches can be used. They were, like Susan said, 50 finalists, and they used very different kinds of methods. And of course, then the skill comes in. It doesn't matter as much what approach you use. If you're really skillful and you put some effort into it, you can do quite well. That was nice to see. And also that it already had an impact. Like we heard in a second webinar that the Valencia team actually advised their government. And some of these predictions came from the model, from the XPRIZE work, and they were taken for the under advisement by the government. So that was useful and interesting to see that it's already having an impact. But there were a couple of surprises, like you said. And I think to me, one of the biggest ones was that there was a community that formed around the competition, that people did not just compete against each other, but they also came together and they helped each other and they came up with ideas and they communicated, and the entire community, it was more fun that way, helping each other. Of course, they competed and wanted to win, but also helping each other is a big part of this kind of a competition when it's focusing on doing something good, good for the common society. And another interesting surprise was that it seems it's possible to also take all of these approaches and build upon them. From the diversity of approaches, we can do something that's more than the sum of their parts. We can put them together systematically using AI and get an even better approach for prediction and prescription. This is work that's being done now, and we'll try to show that it's possible scientifically. But that was also a surprise that from very diverse field, something emerges that supports each other, and that way we can do more than any individual could alone. So those were really interesting outcomes.
I think both of those themes are ones that, you know, as Susan said, this is season 2 of this project, are themes that we want to build on. And it was very encouraging to see how people came together, and hopefully we can technologically kind of build on the collective works. To take us down another path here, and of course the data that backs up this project is fundamental. And for the sake of background, for those that aren't familiar, the way we ran this competition was that the competitors had to submit their models, but then we then had a process whereby we compared the performance of those models to some ground truth data. And without that, we wouldn't have been able to really show how accurate or effective those models were. Toby, the executive director from Oxford here, is the one who contributed the data that led to that ground truth that allowed us to do that. So Toby, maybe you can share with us, first of all, what the type of data was that you contributed that allowed us to do that, and then 2 is how'd you come about sourcing that data?
Yeah, Andrew, and I'd say you know, in some sense, being part of this project and working with the team, it seemed like it was me bringing this data set, but you know, really, I've got to first of all say that it's a data set collected by over 600 volunteers that we've had working with us. So I think that's how we did it. The data itself is it's policy records of policy decisions. So every day we have volunteers looking at what's happening in just about every country around the world and recording in our systematic coding scheme across 20 indicators that cover things like closure measures, so school closures, stay-at-home orders, border closures. We also look at economic measures, so things like income support, things like freezes on debt repayments, things like mortgage help. And we also look, of course, at public health measures, so things like mask mandates, testing, contact tracing. Now we're also tracking policies around vaccinations. Our project came about very similarly to the way Babak described the Cognizant AI platform, in that back this time last year, or even a bit earlier, back in March, we saw the pandemic unfolding. We were researchers at the School of Government in Oxford, at the Blavatnik School, and we thought, we got to do something about this. We should be researching this, and there just wasn't the data on the policies. You know, governments were taking big consequential decisions, and there was no systematic data set reporting them. So we went to build that data set. As I said at the beginning, this is something that's been done manually, and so it's really a huge team effort. As I said, over 600 volunteers, almost 4 million data points, and for the competition, that was able to be the ground truth. So teams were able to train their models, their algorithms, based on the historical data. And then they kind of, if you like, once they submitted, went into a test environment where they could be updated with the real-time data that we were still collecting into January, into the sort of assessment period, based on our ground truth that we were collecting and observing. And those models would would be able to do their predictions based on that and based on how they were built. But obviously without the teams being able to come in and tinker with them after that submission point. So that's kind of the pipeline that we had of, if you like, a volunteer army doing daily updates to a real-time data set. And we're still publishing this live in real time.
Excellent, thank you. And as I said, we couldn't have done any of this work without that. You just articulated that the method you used was somehow you motivated 600 or whatever volunteers to share their data. You know, that's one method, and love to be able to do that everywhere. But the topic of data sharing, now, Amber, I know this is a topic not only near and dear to your heart, it's very much what you work on. As we think about taking this even further, we're going to need to take that data sharing even that much further, both in terms of types of data reach, global presence, et cetera. So maybe you can share with us what some of the obstacles you see that you've seen around that data sharing, be it public or private data sets, of both of which we're going to be looking for. And also, I'd be curious if you've seen now a year plus into the pandemic, if it's changed it, helped it, you know, or not helped it to enable more of that data sharing.
Yeah, you know, I think what Risto said I think is really important in terms of not just team collaboration, but also data. You know, creating something that's greater than the sum of its parts. You can really apply that to the underlying data sets as well. You know, how do you create context in data? How do you understand not just individual data sets or data pieces, but how you bring those together in a more meaningful way so that you can capture deeper insights from that data and really kind of power AI at a whole new level. And I think some of the challenges that we see in that, you know, obviously everybody's familiar with the fact that there are a lot of legacy systems out there that just really aren't set up for data sharing. And so, you know, you can do it in somewhat kind of piecemeal ways, or you can kind of do it in sort of a one-to-one way, but really this kind of mass scale data sharing and all the layers of governance and consent that are required to sit, you know, embedded within that, that's really complex. And so in many respects, you know, that has been one of the challenges to really creating these very large scale data sharing systems and collaborative systems, data sharing systems. You know, I think the other piece to it too is trust, that you really have to, and in addition to creating context and creating connections between all these different types of data that really create a more complete picture of a person or a process or a community, you also have to be able to trust that data. And that trust doesn't just mean like, you know, I trust that the data is sort of coming from a reliable source. That's part of it, but actually trusting the underlying data itself. You know, do I actually have rights to this data? Where did it come from? What's the other data that I understand that helps me sort of understand this data at a deeper level? I think we're starting to kind of see that, but there are still some of those really inherent kind of legacy roadblocks to creating those systems. And it's hard to do. And so overcoming that is really going to be kind of the next evolution.
Have you seen the pandemic make any of that easier, or even if only for a brief period, or for, you know, individual instances of projects or whatever?
Yeah, I think absolutely yes. I mean, we've certainly seen that the pandemic has really encouraged both at an organizational level and also at a regulatory level. You know, how do we really accelerate these processes and make it a little bit easier for researchers to share data with each other in a meaningful way? Certainly, I know there's a lot of efforts underway to create more collaborative research environments, and we've certainly seen that and been a part of those. So I think 100%, yes, the pandemic has really enabled that at a much broader level. And I think that's really just going to continue to accelerate.
I think that's a good segue to maybe a question here that I'll pose to any and all of you. But first, you know, when you think about this conversation to this point in time, we've got, you know, how we used, you know, crowdsourced innovation, how we got innovation around AI towards this particular pandemic, how data and data sharing got us to this point. Now let's think forward. Let's think, you know, if we could just picture ourselves, not a total utopia, say 2 years from now, and we're trying to build on the fact that of all of these elements that we've heard about today, to really create an open public AI utility. That's something that has a constant stream of data supporting it. We're building out, as Risto said, we're being able to combine the innovations in AI together to create a utility that many of those, in the case of some of our competitors, some public health officials already managed to be able to leverage in the context of this competition. But if we could create something like that, and like I said, project yourselves 2 years from now, how do you think that could benefit the world? It's a general question. Babak, I'll start with you, but it's open to all of you to chime in on first focusing on the benefit. Then maybe after that, we'll talk a bit about, well, how would we get there?
Yeah, for starters, I think it would provide the world with a place to go when these sorts of things happen. When the pandemic happened or these sorts of global problems, there's this sense of camaraderie. Everybody wants to pitch in, everybody wants to help. But not everybody has the whole total solution, as we didn't either. In fact, we were searching for data sets that would have the characteristics that then we discovered, Oxford University was putting together and Toby's team was putting together. And later on, we found out that it was exactly around the time when we were searching that they were putting it together. So it kind of came together sort of coincidentally or not, around the same time. So just imagine if this place was already there, maybe a month, 2 months, 3 months before that even, the constituents would be there, the problem statement, the data that's required, the human resources, the intellectual power, and everything. I think we could be even faster in responding to these sorts of issues, for sure.
Amber, Toby, Risto, further comments?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, it really provides a foundation where you can accelerate the pace of research, both during a pandemic or a crisis event in general, but also leading up to it and really kind of being able to get ahead and using predictive models to actually start to understand what is emerging so that you can respond more quickly and so that research can really get ahead of it. So I 100% agree. It really does accelerate research in a huge way. I think the other thing I would add to that is that it provides an opportunity to really get into the ethics of AI and really explore that from a research perspective and understand how we can use AI to create better equity across the board, not just in pandemics, but more generally. That's been a huge area of research around ethics and equity and using AI, and both the challenges with that and some of the problems that we've seen with those. How do we address those and how do we correct those? And how do we use AI, truly use AI for good?
I love that you added that element. It was even representative in seeing, where the submissions came from around the world, both in terms of geography, demographic, et cetera, et cetera. It was very inclusive, but there's more work to be done. I think Risto, and you look like you were going to chime in as well on this topic.
Yeah, I was going to expand on that a bit, that now that we have gone through this exercise and we have evaluated how well things work, we can do a little bit more with the research and models that already exist. We can study counterfactuals, like what would have happened if he had done this and this here and here, and therefore learn something fundamental, perhaps how to respond in the future and be much better prepared. So this is research that still needs to be done, but it could not have been done before the COVID-19, but now it can be done before the next pandemic or next similar problem, and learn principles, not just one case, one off, but something more general and how to deal with these kinds of problems.
Absolutely. And then Toby, I wanted to give you a chance to chime in as well.
Yeah, certainly. I think, the benefits in terms of the pandemic are quite clear. Like, I think there's no doubt in my mind that the more available information is and the better backed it is, the better decision makers are able to make well-informed decisions. And so having something like this that just brings together all of that brain power and all of that effort into better insights is no doubt going to be useful. But I actually think, in sort of the longer arc of history, if you like, what something like this can do is if you think almost of like the way that we share information and data and the way that we collaborate as a type of technology, I actually think we've seen huge advances in that technology just over the last 12 months. There's been giant kind of open data movement around COVID data. Like you just look at what GitHub has turned into as a repository of open data sets. And I think what an initiative like this can do, what a platform like this can do is build on like, what's the next iteration of that sharing technology? What are the new sort of technical and even the social APIs that we're building and that we're using to collaborate between silos, between data sets, between different areas, different specialties. And so, yeah, building out like if the last 12 months of throwing CSVs up on GitHub has been like the first version of this new data sharing and collaboration technology, then what's the next version of that look like?
That's actually a great segue. I was thinking of going to, if we it seems like we share a common vision and or definition of what we could get out of a program like this public AI utility at some point in the future. The next thing is like, what does it need? What we need to get there? You highlighted some advancements, Toby, that would be needed, particularly in scaling up, automating, et cetera, and making more efficient the data sharing element of it. Babak, further thoughts as to other things we need to do to get us to that point?
Yeah, I think it's funny because as an engineer, when you kind of have a picture of something that works, you kind of think it's done. But I think we're only at the beginning of this. I think we roughly know who the constituents are for an AI for Good initiative like the one that we're talking about. And we have at least one instance, one blueprint for how this can work. I think it's naive to think, as Toby says, that this same blueprint can apply to every other, global challenge. Amber mentioned the ethics of this as well, which has to be thought out, I think, for every single different challenge. And so the definition of the challenge itself is a challenge. And so bringing about the means for people to be able to define the problem. There has to be some funding. There has to be, of course, technology contribution, human resource contribution, data contribution, and a timeline and some semblance of management around this. I think thinking this through and making it a repeatable, hosted operation takes much more. And therefore, I think the first step here is for us to start really brainstorming and thinking about what this means and bringing some of the folks that can contribute so that we can repeatedly host these global efforts.
Perfect. Somehow I think those key areas will be a topic of discussion in the coming weeks here. Taking that a step further, Risto, I know with this competition, you and your organization, I mean, you had spent a lot of time even just getting it kickstarted with the tech it needs to get going, the sample models that teams could build off of and use as reference. But knowing that you're knee deep in that, in terms of particularly where we are today with that tech, and again, envisioning where we want to be, is the current state of technology such that we can get there right away? Can we get there quicker, or are there kind of fundamental innovations that are needed, particularly in the AI side, to get us to that point?
Yeah, we can certainly get started, and indeed, because the technology approaches that were used were quite diverse and have different strengths and weaknesses. I think we can get started with new challenges immediately. Of course, these challenges will help improve those technologies, and there's always room for improvement. So indeed, like Babak said, the problem definition and the data, the general setup, I think is a bigger challenge. We can get started and make progress already with the technology. But beyond that, I think understanding what mechanisms work under what conditions, and then forming these collaborations and composite approaches, that's new technology that still needs to be developed. And I think it will come out if we repeat it a couple of times, we'll start learning those principles and can build on them.
Certainly, if there's something XPRIZE can do to also create more crowdsourcing opportunities in that area, that's something we'd like to pursue. Similarly, Toby, you had mentioned about, how you kind of need to scale up the data sharing. Amber, I know this is an area you also focus on, is enabling that. So kind of like the similar type of question to what Risto was chiming in on. Do you have thoughts as to kind of key advancements that are needed in the data sharing paradigm or data sharing space, or the ones that we, at least maybe they're not even defined right now, but areas we need to overcome to get there?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and you guys really touched on it, is as we move more into a crowdsourced approach, and sort of the ultimate version of crowdsourcing is really individual contributions of data. I mean, that's kind of the panacea if we can get everyone to volunteer and contribute data. That's really the end game of what you like to get to in terms of crowdsourcing. But fundamentally, in order to get there, you have to have a more person-centered approach to how you're managing data, how you're managing contributions of data, how that data is being used, so that people actually have visibility and control, and they can actually trust the system that they're contributing to. And a lot of those technologies exist today. A lot of this is really what we do, but fundamentally kind of both in terms of how you're modeling data and taking a more kind of person-centered or kind of holistic approach to how you bring data together in context, but also how you manage security and governance and consent. And fundamentally, consent is, mandated in, at this point, some form or another, most jurisdictions. But consent is fundamentally just the most individual form of governance. So how do you start to bring together governance and consent and all of the security that's required that allows people to confidently contribute data and insights and even their intellectual property and their intellectual capital into these movements, into these challenges? And that is really, I think, the next step of where we need to go in order to create the kind of environment, the kind of collaborations where people can really confidently contribute and be a part of those communities. So I think that's a really key part of it, is how do you create these more person-centric approaches, both in terms of the data modeling, but also in terms of how you're managing governance and consent.
It's interesting. I think, well, I'll take a little twist on what you just added there. When we think about where we're going with this, as a matter of fact, we've had one partner, World Quant Predictive, who has offered to share private data sets, commercial data sets that could help us drive solutions forward. The point you were addressing, I think, as it relates to the sharing of private data, there's two lenses to look at through it. With one is the consent of the individual who owns that data. Also, it's engaging other organizations who might, healthcare providers or other, who might be sitting on data sets that they could contribute. And these are, we know from running this challenge, most of those our teams did not have access to in developing their solutions. They just had to go out with what was available in the public domain, or others like Toby were aggregating. Any thoughts, Amber, based on your experience working on healthcare data, how we could start to motivate other organizations like what World Quant is doing to both, bring their data to the table and provide an environment where they can comfortably share it?
Yeah, I think fundamentally it goes back to that trust issue. How do you provide an environment where someone can fundamentally trust that what they're contributing, they understand how that's being used, they can pull it back if they need to. I think that exists both at an individual level, like I was saying before, but also, to your point, at an organizational level and at a researcher level. So, if I'm the controller of some highly sensitive data, and I want to contribute that for the greater good, but I also have some pretty strong restrictions on how I can share it. I may want to control what it's shared for, so that it's not just a completely open data set that anybody can use. I want to control how it's being used. All of those things kind of need to be built into governance models to engender the trust, so that your contributors of data are actually willing to contribute and have the full visibility into how that data is actually being used and managed within that community. I think the other piece to it too is that for researchers in particular, whether they're academic researchers or on the commercial side, there's a really strong intellectual property component. And how do you actually enable the kind of collaborative environment that allows researchers to contribute and still maintain that intellectual property so that they're not, losing control of the assets that they're contributing to that system, not just data assets, but knowledge. And so really, I think it all really kind of boils down to how you build a system that's really trusted.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it'll apply equally as much to the AI as well, that we get others to contribute to this, or other technology and tools. Not to keep it all focused on private data sets, which is fundamentally important, but also we saw, of course, Toby, with the work you did, the public data sets, that how they benefited the program. And I remember we were talking about midway through the competition here, we challenged the teams to submit their predictors in December, just at the time that vaccines were starting to roll out, and you were starting to collect data sets around vaccine distribution, which can drastically change the models. And while obviously we couldn't keep changing the data as we're progressing forward, but knowing that that data set that you started with evolved a bit, it'd be good to, a couple questions. One is, how did it evolve? What other elements and lenses did you start looking at the pandemic through beyond the COVID spread and the interventions that you had talked about earlier? And then two is, how might we extend this further? You said you got 600 plus volunteers. How'd you do that, and how can we make that 6,000 or 60,000 going forward?
Yeah, so and as you said, we're adding that vaccine data basically right in the middle of the X Prize, and in our project we're constantly expanding and adding new indicators based on where we see the kind of frontier of pandemic policy. We're always trying to record the most relevant actions that governments are taking, and so I think apart from vaccines at the moment, one of the big things over the next 12 months that we're thinking about are kind of the other health measures around testing and tracing and contact tracing, because it seems like vaccines won't be a 100% solution there. But more broadly in our research, apart from just collecting the data, we're also, I think, trying to understand better how policy decisions are impacting behavior and how behavior is impacting health outcomes. So if you like, there's kind of a bit of a very simple causal chain that I can describe, where governments make policy, and the policy itself doesn't change what happens to the pandemic, but the policy will affect people's behavior, and people's behavior, that will affect transmission, and that will affect pandemic outcomes. And we have pretty good data, or we think we're working really hard to collect that good data on that first part of the chain, what the policies actually are. And then, we've got good data sources on what the health outcomes are and how the pandemic's spreading. What I think we really need to unlock is that middle part of the chain about what behaviors people are taking. And so we can draw links, and which we can't do particularly well at the moment at a big scale, between which policy, which mixes of policies will actually change people's behavior. And the whole X Prize kind of did skip over that middle bit because it drew the link between policies and pandemic outcomes. What I thought was really fascinating was to hear from one of the winning teams that did try to bring in a couple of extra data sets. I think they described weather data and some other data. It didn't actually improve their model particularly. And to me, that's very counterintuitive. So the researcher in me thinks we need to get some more of these data sets that help us in a big way understand things like people's economic conditions at an individual level, the public sentiment that people are exposed to, their mobility and actual move behavior around. It's really the kind of stuff that Amber was describing as individuals contributing their data about their behavior. I think if we can build in that part of the chain, from policy to behavior change to pandemic outcomes, it'll really help us build models that much better and even more accurately can explain and help predict where the pandemic's going. I think the last thing I would add, so would love to see very creative ways to bring in data that helps us just understand and describe behavior change. The other thing I'd say is open government data in machine readable formats. One of the things that is just boggled my mind about this pandemic is that almost all the data that we have that's internationally comparable on cases, on testing, on deaths, on vaccination numbers, these are kind of numbers and statistics that don't really require interpretation. They're almost all manually collected by groups similar to ours. And whereas we're collecting policy data, and so there's an argument we need people doing that work to do the interpretation of what does this policy mean. For something like how many vaccinations are being delivered, there's teams of people that are just going to every health department's website to get those numbers. And so, I think there's probably quite a push on the data side to get standards written and adopted by governments so that can all be automated and standardized.
I think thank you for that. Just like we were talking about what the fundamental elements of what's needed to get us to this 2-year utopia, what you just talked about outlined a whole track, I think, that we need to focus on. Just a reminder to everybody that's on the call, any other questions that you might have, please put them in the chat. But let me build on the angle we said earlier, which was, and I think Risto mentioned it, but where maybe there's other competitions that can help us drive innovation here. So, but Bach, since you were one of the ones who started the conversation around the use of crowdsourcing innovation in this area, any thoughts on how we could continue to leverage that approach to build kind of these future resilience efforts?
Yeah, I mean, there were some very interesting learnings through the pandemic response challenge. One is that we need to make sure that the methodology that we use to aggregate and conglutinate, put together these models that are contributed are not too prescriptive on the actual approaches. So they need to be agnostic to the actual approaches taken. If we do this, then and we can do this by defining standards and APIs for contributions that are an arm's length from the actual approach. Somebody wants to use an SEIR model, somebody wants to use a statistics-based model, a machine learning-based model, doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, they want to make some predictions, want to make some prescriptions. That's what we care about at the API level. This will allow us to have the underlying technology be kind of future-proof, so that if new technologies come along, people can actually contribute, they can innovate, depending on the problem, depending on the situation. And it also expands the contributor base. So we're not just talking to AI folks. We actually deliberately didn't want this to be only for folks that do deep learning or AI or machine learning in a very specific way. So I think we need to continue having that in mind. And of course, on the other end, we need to make sure that the contributions are accretive to a larger whole, as Risto talked about. So that also puts some requirements on this other end. There is also learnings that we can bring in from the pandemic response challenge around how we assess and validate the contributions. Not just the contributions in isolation, but also how the contribution contributes to a greater whole and makes the entire system better. These standards, these means could be generalized, I think, bringing in. Also, to build on what Toby was talking about, one of the things that we found to be very, very useful in the data that we got from Oxford was the fact that they actually harmonized the policy data, the policy decisions across regions. This was very, very important. Now, just imagine if there is a global problem and people are bringing in, contributing locally aggregated data. There has to be a way to bring that in and make it, again, accretive. So it's not just the models and the approaches that we're talking about. We're really talking about the end-to-end, all the way down to the data, the way it's collected, the way it's harmonized. One policy around school closure might not be exactly equivalent to school closure in another country. So we need an authority to be mindful of that. And I think that's another element to bring in.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I think, what we've heard here, first off, is, all of these parameters or tracks that we would need to address to turn this into that public AI utility. So I think it'll come as no surprise to everybody on the call. this is what we intend to do. And so this is the starting point for that program. We are initiating a program with support of our key partners here, ITU, Cognizant, AWS World Quant Predictive, Burst IQ, to take this forward. We're codenaming it Project Resilience at the moment. So if you see communications coming out around it, that's what it's referencing. And the starting point will be organizing around, well, where do we need to focus? What do we need to do? But since we're coming up towards the end of the hour, I did want to throw out that we've been talking about, all the different areas we need to focus on as a program. Now, a question to all of the panelists here. We have a community of data science, AI for good, interested parties on the call. Any call to actions you'd have for them, things that you'd want to say, hey, we could really use this, we could use this capability, this technology, this effort, et cetera, obviously building on the tracks that we just started. So maybe Risto, I'll start with you if you've got some things that come to mind and just go through each of you.
Yeah, the key to solutions and challenges is diversity, that we have many different approaches represented and in the community. And we know that from biological evolution, we know that from computational evolution, and we learned that from the XPRIZE that we just concluded. So people should not think that there's indeed right now the most popular approach might be, I don't know, deep learning or something. So everybody has to do that. No, it's much better that you take what you know and think about how you could apply it to this task. And then you make a contribution, even if it turns out that it's not necessarily a winning entry, it can still contribute to this common collection of useful techniques, and we can build on it, and it can contribute. So I think that's a key realization from what we learned. So everybody who has a technique that might be applicable, please contribute.
Thank you. Amber, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think, I 100% agree with that. I would add that contributions can obviously be data contributions, but there are lots of other kinds of contributions as well. For folks who have a deep understanding of certain types of data, what's the ideal way of modeling that data? How do you build flexibility? To Babak's point, I think flexibility is really, really critical. And so how do you, can folks contribute data models that allow the system to be more flexible? Can you contribute, methods of mapping data? And best practices around mapping data so that if there are two data sets that aren't exactly aligned, how do you align them? Those kinds of contributions are equally as valuable. Governance contributions, how do you actually translate policy and governance for a particular region? How do you translate that into the technical underpinnings of the system and how it actually enforces governance? All of those things are really valuable contributions.
And thank you. And Toby, just in case you have some more of your 600 volunteers on the call or potential volunteers, any call to action for that or for anything else related to how we get there?
Yeah, look, I mean, for our project, we're always on the eye out for people that can help us collect data. For Project Resilience, I think the big challenge there, definitely there's technical challenges, but to sort of go to Babak's point about needing some way to harmonize things, like if you've got a school closure over here and a school closure over there, they're going to be described in different ways. They're going to, if we're just bringing in unstructured data, they're not necessarily going to be comparable in any meaningful way. And so it goes to what kind of systems will be built for dispute resolution, as Amber was saying, for aligning data sets that are almost the same but not quite the same. How can you link them together while understanding the variation? Now, to me, I don't really have any experience myself in the open source community, but to me, this really feels like something that open source project governance knows about, knows how to solve. I think people with those sorts of skills will be useful. What you don't want is something that ends up like the internet before Google, that's just kind of like an unsearchable, uninterpretable mess of user submitted data. Organizing that, I think, is a huge technical and governance task. And I think people that have ideas and thoughts around that will be pretty valuable in the period going forward.
Great advice. We'll also provide a way for people to reach out if they do have any of those ideas. We'll close it out with you, Babak, any further thoughts on what I said as far as a call to action to our community here?
Absolutely. First of all, let me just list in my mind the types of folks that can contribute, and this is a call to action, as you said, Andrew. So let's put it out there. We're looking for communities, regional authorities where the problem is manifesting itself, and to come help us define it. And then, of course, once we have solutions to help apply the AI. We're looking at AI, the AI and ML community, statistical modeling community as a whole, the data community, not just provisioning the data, but also the infrastructure that's needed, and harmonizing the data and all the good stuff that Amber and Toby also talked about. Infrastructure, cloud capacity, expertise beyond just the AI ML, software engineering, UI UX designers, data engineers, what have you. This is a call to action. Financial backing is a very important piece of this. If you want to help us make this happen, this does not happen in a vacuum. Now, of course, Cognizant is very, very much committed strategically to AI for good. So we're there. We're going to commit resources. We're going to commit tech. But Cognizant alone can't do this. Let me just end by saying, we all, most of us went through this idealistic phase where we thought, wow, tech, it's so cool. I'm going to use tech for helping humanity. Just think of your 12-year-old self, where you got into this and you were thinking, this is amazing. And if somebody asked you wanted to be a fireman, or you wanted to build a computer to help humanity, this is the opportunity. Let's go beyond just using tech for, making money, which is also good. But this is AI for good. So let's make it happen. This is our opportunity.
Thank you for that call to action. I'll put up a slide just to remind people of the email address of how they can get involved. But and we've covered the areas that they can. You see that email address, pandemicresponse@xprize.org, which I also put in the chat. We've already covered the areas here where you can get involved. Two things before I hand it over back to ITU. One is I want to thank our panelists here. Not only did you drive a great conversation and thought-provoking topics, but also you helped get us here and are going to help take us forward. So I appreciate your time and appreciate you sharing with us. And I do want to again, keep everybody, stay tuned for updates around how we've launched this Project Resilience program. We will be establishing a workshop of the key partners to put the framework together and then take it forward to have a broader outreach to the community. In the meantime, you see that email address. Please contact us if you have any of these resources, thought leadership, et cetera, where you might be able to get involved. So thank you all for that. I will stop sharing, hand it back over to you, Fred, to close us out with any final words.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you to the moderator and speakers and partners for putting together this amazing session. I think this really was a good example of AI for Good in action, and we're really looking forward to continuing this partnership. Before I go forward, I'd like to ask my colleague to put up a very quick satisfaction survey, which could, of course, help us to do better sessions in the future. And while that's being put up, I'll just make a few announcements. So we have a few interesting keynotes coming up, something completely different. So tomorrow we actually have a keynote by Mikko Hyppinen. He's the Chief Research Officer of F-Secure, one of the top cybersecurity experts in the world. And he'll be doing a keynote presentation called Malware and Machine Learning, a Match Made in Hell. So I think that's one of the more creative titles we've come up with. And I'm really looking forward to this talk. And the following week, on the 13th of May, we have another keynote. And this would be AI and heart attack prevention, the story of Iker Casillas. And for those of you who don't know who Iker Casillas is, maybe for our friends in the US, he's the goalie of Real Madrid. He won the World Cup for Spain. He was voted best goalie in the world 5 years in a row. So very well known in Europe. And he has a really amazing story of how he basically suffered a heart attack and how he's now combining AI and wearables to monitor heart health, but also to go beyond his own health and to try and reduce heart disease by a third in accordance with one of the UN SDGs. So that's next week. Should be really interesting as well. And of course, we'll be having another workshop on the topic of resilience, project resilience, in a couple weeks' time. So the exact date will be communicated very soon. Holding date is the 19th of May. But if you're subscribed to our newsletter and check out our website, more information on that will be forthcoming. So last but not least, once again, we've reached the end of another webinar. Thank you to XPRIZE, to the partners, to the speakers, to the participants for great questions and interaction. And signing off and wishing you all a pleasant evening. Thank you and goodbye.
Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector.